Hey everybody, welcome back. This video is all about federalism. Let's get right to it. Okay, so this video is going to build on the last video about constitutional principles. What we're going to focus on is the evolving interpretation of certain parts of the Constitution, as well as how the relationship between the states and the national government has changed over time. And as we start, real quick, do me a favor and hit that like button. Thanks. So let's begin by defining federalism. Federalism is the division of power between national, states, and local governments. Okay, simple enough. So right away, we can see that the US system is quite unique, with multiple levels of government that each have power over certain aspects of policy, but don't have power in other areas. We can identify three types of powers that we need to differentiate: delegated, reserved, and concurrent powers. Now, delegated powers are those that are given to the federal government. These include things like declaring war, coining money, raising an army, and regulating interstate commerce. So only the federal government can do these things. Reserve powers, on the other hand, are powers kept by the states. I know that sounds weird, but remember that the states existed before the national government, and according to the 10th Amendment, everything that wasn't delegated to the federal government or denied to the states is reserved to the states. So basically everything that wasn't mentioned in the Constitution, including things like education, licensing, and a general police power that allows states to make laws on things like health, safety, and welfare, these all belong to the states. And concurrent powers are held by both the national government and state governments. For example, both can raise taxes and borrow money. Please be clear that this does not mean that they're working together. They're not. It just means that these are powers that each level of government has. It's important to realize that this relationship can be referred to as dynamic federalism, and that's because this relationship has changed and continues to change over time. For the most part, this change has resulted in the federal government gaining more power at the state's expense, but there are some counterexamples that we'll consider. And as part of that transition, the US has shifted away from dual federalism and more towards cooperative federalism. Dual federalism is kind of the OG idea, that the states and federal government would each be supreme in their own sphere of power and there wouldn't be any overlap between the two. It'd always be very clear whether something was a state or a federal issue. This is sometimes described as layer cake federalism because you can clearly tell where one flavor ends and the other begins, just like with state and federal power. But by the Great Depression and the New Deal, there was a shift towards cooperative federalism, where the federal government and states share their responsibilities, costs, and administration of policies. What's really happening here is that the federal government discovered a loophole, nay, a loop chasm, to increase its power. And like everybody already knows, when you want to know who has the power, you have to follow the money. Because that's what's really happening here. The federal government provides money to states if states are willing to implement a policy that the federal government wants. Now, you might be asking, well, why doesn't the federal government just make the policy themselves if they want it so bad? And that's a good question, friend, but there's a little thing called the Constitution, and that Constitution reserves powers to the states. So this is the next best option. So let's talk about 4 different ways the federal government and states interact when it comes to money and policy. Let's start with federal revenue sharing, a program that ended 35 years ago. This provided federal money to the states with basically no strings attached. The federal government would provide money to the states, and the states were pretty much free to use that money as they saw fit. So states definitely loved this program. On the other end of the spectrum are mandates. These can be either funded or unfunded. Mandates are rules of something that states must do. The classic AP Gov example is of the unfunded mandate that was part of the Americans with Disabilities Act that required states to make all public buildings like schools and courthouses wheelchair accessible. The federal government didn't provide any money to the states to pay for this, so states had to do something the federal government told them to do, and they had to pay for it themselves. So states, not fans of mandates. Now, in between those are 2 types of grants, block and categorical. Block grants provide money to states for use within a broad purpose. For example, a block grant might provide money for education, and the state could use that money for anything within education. They could use it for building new schools or hiring teachers or new technology in the classroom. It just has to be spent on education. It cannot be spent on highways or healthcare or anything else. So block grants provide states with more freedom, but not total freedom regarding how to spend that money. Categorical grants provide money to states for a specific purpose, and sometimes these come with conditions of aid or incentives. Now, this money has to be spent on a more specific purpose than block grants. So instead of providing money for education, a categorical grant would be specifically for new school construction, and that's the only thing states could do with that money. Sometimes Congress attaches conditions of aid or incentives to a categorical grant. That could be something like, if your state agrees to follow this new national education curriculum, we'll provide you with $50 million for school construction. So you see what's happening here, right? The federal government is low-key making policy in areas that are supposed to be reserved to the states. Now, technically, it's the states making the policies, and the states could say no to that money if they didn't want to agree to the conditions. So the federal government gains power, and the states get to spend money, but have to listen to the federal government if they take the money. Now, the other big reason that we've seen such a shift in power from the states to the federal government has to do with changing interpretations of several constitutional amendments. The Necessary and Proper Clause, the 10th Amendment, the Commerce Clause. We're going to talk about these, but let's start with the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is in Article 1, Section 8, and doesn't seem to be anything too extraordinary. It says that Congress can regulate interstate commerce. So if there's some kind of trade or buying and selling taking place between people who live in different states, Congress can make laws about that trade. Okay, so what's the big deal? Well, the interpretation of this clause has shifted over time, greatly expanding congressional power. In an 1824 case, the Supreme Court held that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce. Okay, that makes sense. You don't want to have conflicting laws on the same thing. But then something very interesting happens starting in 1937. The court reinterprets the Commerce Clause very broadly, determining that only Congress can regulate anything affecting interstate commerce. In a famous or infamous 1942 case, depending on your perspective, Wickard versus Filburn, the court went so far as to rule that a farmer growing grain on his own farm and feeding it to his own animals was engaged in interstate commerce, even though he wasn't buying or selling anything, nor was anything crossing state lines. Well, what was their reasoning? If every farmer did what Filburn did, it would affect the interstate market for wheat and grain, therefore, he was engaged in interstate commerce. And remember, the reason this matters is because it means that Congress can now make laws regulating anything affecting interstate commerce. And for nearly 60 years, that pretty much gave Congress a blank check to legislate just about anything they wanted. So what's the limit? Is there anything that doesn't affect interstate commerce? Well, stick around, I'll answer that in just a couple minutes. Another important clause that has expanded federal power is the Supremacy Clause. It basically says that federal laws are superior to state laws when the two come into conflict. Now you might remember that Brutus #1 had some words to say about this Supremacy Clause. Not a fan. And then there's the Necessary and Proper Clause, sometimes called the Elastic Clause. Article 1, Section 8 enumerated a bunch of powers of Congress, and then at the end, the last line says, and oh, by the way, Congress also has the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. This allows Congress to make laws on things in addition to their enumerated powers, as long as they can justifiably link the law to one of their enumerated powers. So this greatly expands congressional power. One of your required cases in this section is McCulloch versus Maryland, and it actually has to do with two of these clauses. So the first part of the case was deciding whether or not Congress could create a national bank, because the Constitution never expressly says that they could. The court used the Necessary and Proper Clause to determine that Congress has implied powers and therefore was allowed to create a national bank because the function of the bank was related to some of their enumerated powers, like borrowing and coining money. The court also held that states cannot tax the national government, because the power to tax is the power to destroy, and this would make the states superior to the national government, and this conflicts with the Supremacy Clause, which says that the opposite is true. Then there are two amendments that seem to pull in opposite directions regarding this balance of power between the states and the federal government. I'm talking about the 10th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment is very different from the first 10 amendments because it actually increases the power of the federal government, and it even goes so far as to specifically limit state power. Now, it strengthens the federal government when it comes to the power to protect civil rights, and additionally has been interpreted to cause states to have to be restricted by the Bill of Rights, just like the federal government is, although you'll have to wait till the civil liberties video to see why that is. On the other hand, the 10th Amendment reserves rights to the states. It doesn't list the powers of states, but rather says that everything not delegated to the federal or denied to the states is reserved to the states. But following the New Deal, this sort of became like a forgotten or ignored amendment. That changed in the 1995 case, U.S. versus Lopez, in which the court struck down the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act, holding that Congress had exceeded their Commerce Clause powers. Now, it's important to note that this did not change the broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause. It is still true that Congress can regulate anything affecting interstate commerce. This case is notable because it finally found a limit to what affects interstate commerce. It also used the 10th Amendment to remind everybody that some powers are reserved to the states and that a distinction remains between what belongs to the states and the federal government. So, how does the federal system affect policymaking? Well, for one thing, it offers citizens multiple access points from which they can influence policy. States are often able to make their own policies, choosing what they think fits the needs of their state. In this way, they function as laboratories of democracy, experimenting by making new policies, and other states can sit back and watch and decide if that's something that they might want to emulate or not. Marijuana policy in Colorado is a great example of this. At times, having all of these different policies constrains the ability of the national government to have a unified policy nationwide. Alright everybody, that's it for this episode on federalism. Make sure to pause the video so that you can answer these multiple choice questions, test yourself, and see how well you understand the changing relationship between the states and national government. Put your answers in the comments below, and then check your answers using the answer key in the description below. Alright, so until next time, this has been a LaMoney production. Thanks again for watching this video. Make sure to hit that like button for me if you didn't already. Subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. What are you waiting for? And make sure to check out the AP Gov Ultimate Review Packet. Has full-length practice tests, 2 of them, has great study guides, a ton of exclusive content. Be sure to check it out. I promise it'll help you so much in your class and on the AP test. See you next time.